Welcome to the Bridge the Divide podcast with Erica Turner and Heidi Wheeler, hosts and founders of the group Bridge the Divide Cedarburg. We hope to provide a forum for discussion and action around racial reconciliation. We seek to identify instances of inequality, foster empathy, and educate others to recognize their part in problems and solutions in Ozaukee County and beyond.
Hello, Bridge community. Welcome back to another podcast brought to you by Erica and Heidi.
We're on a roll.
We haven't missed very many, right?
No, we're back in the swing because there's lots to talk about and a lot of great
There's
guests.
a ton to talk about. And our lovely producer, Jeff, and our host at CPL Radio is always game for a good podcast. So we figure we'll just keep them coming. And please, we don't say this as much as we should. If you have ideas, if you have thoughts about a guest, if you have a topic that you think would be something that we can talk through, we would love to do it. We're not limiting, what kind of things we talk about on a podcast, but it's also great to be CEOs of your own podcast. So Heidi and Erica talk about what they want to talk about.
Mm-hmm.
Yay us. But today we have reached out to friends. And if you've been listening to us for any length of time, we talk about race. We talk about race and racism and how racism shows up and what kind of things we can do to help eradicate racism, help get people turned towards anti-racism versus just not being racist. But you also hear a lot of things about African Americans and white people. And part of that is because, hello, I'm Erica, I'm Black.
And I'm Erica and I'm white. I'm Heidi and I'm white.
So a lot of times that's how our conversations go, because that's the place that we know most about. That's the easiest for us to reach out and share lived experiences with you about race. But we also try to make sure you understand that there isn't a binary in the country, that racism solely affects Black people, that the only conflict or the only crucial conversation is white and Black. There are lots of other races around that are having the struggle, and some are having those conversations. And we're trying to work on making sure we can amplify their voices here too. And today we have a lovely Oneida citizen of Ozaukee County, Ms. Kate Erickson. Kate, thank you so much for coming.
Thank you for inviting me.
Yes. Introduce yourself to us.
Well, as Erica said, my name is Kate Erickson. I am an enrolled member of the Oneida Nation of Wisconsin, and I have lived in Cedarburg since about, I think it was 2007, 2008. And I am currently a history faculty at the Milwaukee Area Technical College.
Good to have you, Kate.
Thank you so much for coming. We appreciate it. We need all the voices. So
I'm happy to add.
One of the things that we talk about a lot is, folks' lived experiences. If we think that it's important for you to listen to the voices of Black, Indigenous, people of color, African Americans, Asian Americans, we need you to hear those voices. So we need to help bring those voices to you because, again, we are in Ozaukee County, where proximity to people of color or it's very low.
Limited.
It just is. So we want to bring your voice so that folks who have not had a meaningful, intimate conversation with Indigenous folk can have a virtual conversation with you and they can listen to your story. And how would you tell your story? What, we have an open-ended that if we say, hello, it's nice to meet you, Kate, tell me your story. How would you do that?
Well, for me, my story isn't, the universal experience, of a native growing up in Wisconsin, or the Great Lakes region. But I would have to say, I'm sure a lot of natives have experienced some of the things that I have growing up. I may live in Cedarburg now, but I actually grew up in northern Wisconsin, in Shawano. It's about half-hour northwest of Green Bay. It also happens to be just a few miles south of the Menominee and the Stockbridge-Muncie-Mohican reservations. So Shawano was and is predominantly white, but there is a large Latino or Hispanic population, as well as a lot of natives in proximity due to the two reservations just to the north of Shawano. But my experience growing up was a direct reflection of my grandmother's experience as a child. So the way she was raised then in turn determined how I was raised in that town. So my grandmother, Dorothy, my father's mother, was 100% Oneida, full blood. And she was the oldest of 5 children. And at the age of 5, she was placed in a boarding school in Wittenberg, Wisconsin. And the whole idea of these boarding schools was to essentially make Native children white. A lot of the catchphrase was "kill the Indian and save the man," and this comes, wow. Yeah, it's Kate, it's reflective Kate, of what happened.
Around what decade was this?
I'm just so the boarding schools were largely in operation from the Civil War, just to the end of the Civil War. We have the first federally sanctioned and funded boarding school opening up in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, the Carlisle Indian Industrial School. And then the boarding schools, by and large, ran well up into the early 1970s.
Oh, wow.
So we're talking mid to late 1860s up into the 1970s. And really the premise was, we're going to teach you how to be white. Oftentimes, if you had a name that was too indigenous, they would change it. They would cut your hair. You were forbidden from speaking your language or practicing any of your customs. She, at her particular school, learned how to cook and to clean, how to take care of kids, but it was very military regimented. You lived by bells and whistles. There was a lot of physical and sexual abuse that was happening in the schools. Many of the boarding schools actually have cemeteries because of the children that oftentimes died from poor treatment or from disease. They were breeding grounds for disease, because many of the European diseases, natives had never experienced them before. So you kind of have this perfect storm where these smallpox and other things would the dormitories. But her school in particular, one of their modes of punishment for speaking your language, and in her case it was Oneida, they would take the fingers of your left hand and they would place them in the door jamb by the hinges and slam the door shut on your fingers, flattening them.
Gosh.
So I never understood why. She had terrible arthritis, but you could tell that the fingers on her left hand were a little bit wider and flatter than the ones on her right hand. And a lot of that had to do.
So it happened multiple times.
Oh, yes. Yes.
Kate, just for context, as we're listening to your story, who is the they? Is it the federal government or is it private institutions?
So these schools were sanctioned by the federal government. And with the sheer number of children, so it's very much along the idea of you can't teach an old dog new tricks. It's much easier to change the children. They're like little sponges. You can mold them. So schools like Carlisle served as the model for boarding schools as they spread across the country. After a while, we've got so many schools popping up that the federal government is not able to pay to run them all solely. So what the government ended up doing was hiring churches
Mhm.
to operate these facilities.
Mhm.
So the facility that my grandmother was in Wittenberg, Wisconsin, was a Lutheran facility. So the
So
churches were
save the man is save them physically from the barbarianism and save them
Their
their
souls.
religion. Yeah, save their
Yes.
souls.
Mhm.
And this is part of the larger practice. So when we're talking about the time frame that these schools are beginning, we are at that time still in the 1850s, 1860s, being placed on reservations in order to open up land for settlement. Now, the idea was these reservations could be schools of assimilation, where you live in these fenced areas. It's often referred to as concentration policy because you're concentrating natives down onto these small pieces of land where you can control the food they can eat. You can control the housing they live in, the clothing they wear, the language they're allowed to speak. If you were going to be going to the Indian agent office to ask for help or assistance, they would demand you do it in English. So it was, we have you captive, we can start to Americanize you. Because eventually the federal government realizes, oh shoot, some of this reservation land is actually valuable, like the Black Hills, for example, and the area of Mount Rushmore. And realizing that natives aren't disappearing, we're not assimilating into American society and quietly fading away, because by that point in time, the federal government has realized that the hundreds of treaties they had made with promises of, we'll let you keep this land forever. We'll pay for your healthcare for forever. We'll pay for your education for forever. To them, for forever was starting to look like for forever. So if we can force the indigenous into American society and have them fade away by being embraced by America, then the reservations go away. The need to pay for what they promised under the treaties goes away. So allowing the churches to help would speed up this process of Americanizing and by and large Christianizing. And it worked with my grandmother in her case. She left school when she was 15, did not know her language, did not know her culture, the customs, because essentially she had been converted to Christianity. Now, during the summers, while she was still in school, a lot of these schools, and not just the church-run schools, but a lot of them would have summer outing programs where students could be sent to live with white families in order to, in their mind, practice what they've learned. We're seeing how well they fit in. And she was farmed out to one of the local Lutheran Norwegian families in the area. And so this is all Shawano County area, Wittenberg, Bowler, whatnot. And during the summer, she essentially served as their free live-in nanny and maid. Now, when she finished school at 15, one of the fears was that these students would go back to the blanket, as they called it. We didn't want these children to go back to their tribes, to go back to the reservations. We wanted them to, fit into American society. But when she got out of school, she didn't really have a relationship with her parents. She didn't really know her parents. And the younger siblings that had been born while she was at school, she didn't really have a relationship with them either. You know, she's not really white, but she's not really Oneida either. You know, so that feeling of, you know, being in between two worlds, not really fitting. So she went back to what she knew, and she married into the family that she had been farmed out to over the summers. And that's how she met my grandfather, who was born in Norway. He immigrated when he was 4, and he was around 20 years her senior. So she was quite a bit younger, quite a bit younger. Yes, quite a bit younger.
What about your grandmother's, her physical, you know, sometimes we'll talk about, like, my grandmother was light enough and had features that were ambiguous enough that she passed. What was the physical look of your grandmother? Did she present as white? Was it something that people thought they could see right away, or not really?
The way that she dressed and the way that she spoke and the way in which she carried herself did not fit what was stereotypically Native back then. And she would regularly say, "I'm not an Indian, I'm French Canadian." She'd tell, "That's why I have a little bit darker complexion. I'm French Canadian."
Sounds like some real code switching there.
Yep, as a way to cover for it, you know. And then you mix in my grandfather, who was blonde hair, blue eyes, you know, Norwegian through and through. Their children were, by and large, able to pass as white, which she insisted they do.
So the schooling, it kind of worked. It stripped her. It stripped her of her identity.
It did. And unfortunately, she did not learn how to parent. You know, you look at children, you know, and my daughter included. She's 10 years old. She's in 4th grade. I remember her watching her play with her baby dolls, you know, and mimicking songs I had sang to her, you know, or not, you know, nighttime routines and whatnot. You know, children learn how to parent by watching their parents. And she grew up in essentially a military boarding school.
Yeah.
So not knowing how to parent, coupled with no therapy at all for what she had experienced, she developed a serious alcohol problem. And it didn't help that Grandpa was the leading moonshine maker and runner in the area as well. So that was a volatile combination. Very much so.
Wow. So much context there.
Right.
Yeah.
And a question about the oral history passing down. I mean, these are some of the similarities that I see with Indian families and Black families, about talking about your ancestors and telling those stories, so that you don't forget, so that you don't disappear from history. Like, you know, if you go by a book that you see or the television shows, that's not the real history, and you hear it, you know, in passing this down. So how did you as a child know and hear all these stories, and there are things that you, or was it something like, oh, this is something secret, and then one day when you grew up you found out all of these things about, you know, things that Grandma had to go through? And
it was very secret. It was very, very secret. And everything I have learned about my grandmother's experience actually came from my aunt. My grandmother, and I only directly asked her about school one time. She made it very clear she did not want to talk about it. But a lot of what we know of her experiences oftentimes came from what she would say while she was intoxicated.
Oh, interesting.
Those things would slip out,
Mm.
where when her children were younger, if they were misbehaving and she was frustrated with them, you think you have it so bad, things would come out. You oftentimes, have a hard time holding your tongue in those cases. And I knew I was Native. I knew I was Oneida. I knew enough that I looked different from, say, my mother's side of the family. It was obvious with some of our physical features, skin tone, things like that, that we were something else.
Mm-hmm.
But that was never talked about. That was one of those things where, as she and my grandfather were having children, they were raised Norwegian and Christian. They didn't have too much of a relationship with, say, my great-grandparents, my grandmother's parents, until my great-grandparents were quite elderly. And in that situation, my grandmother was then able to help and care for her parents in a way that her siblings couldn't. So later in life, she did have a fairly decent relationship with her parents. But by and large, in my family, the language was not passed down. Customs, the culture, because it literally had been beaten into my grandmother that being an Indian was dirty. It was bad. You were going to go to hell. You needed to be white and Christian and good. So being Native was not something you discussed in front of grandma if you didn't want a tongue lashing.
Well, how, as grandchild and moving, you stayed in the area of Shawano while you were growing up. So how did that translate for you and your upbringing? This some of the effects of what grandma had to go through, or the lack of, if she really wasn't willing to talk about it much.
Now, it was one of those things where I would get bits and pieces as I grew up. Now, my father, being that my grandmother was 100% Oneida and my grandfather was 100% Norwegian, he was 50-50, half of each. And that, which is still the requirement now, you had to be at least 1/4 blood in order to be enrolled in the tribe, at least for Oneida standards. Every tribe is different as to the amount. But because he was half, that made me 1/4, 25%. Now, there was arguing between my parents when my brother was younger as to whether or not we were going to be tribally enrolled. There are things with education in the country, programs such as Johnson O'Malley and other things that were created back in the 1930s, where school districts can actually get funding for Native children who attend their schools. So school districts want to know if you're enrolled or not. Unfortunately, though, my parents decided not to tell the school district that we were tribally enrolled. So I was enrolled in the tribe when I was in 2nd grade. And instead of letting the school district know, my parents chose not to. And a lot of that had to do with the atmosphere of the Shawano area. And the attitudes towards the Native population. Now, Shawano is it's one of those unique areas, really, in the country. The Menominee Nation was one of the first tribes in the United States to be terminated by the federal government in the 1950s. And what that meant was, according to the federal government, the tribe no longer existed. They weren't a tribe. They weren't a reservation, and the Menominee Reservation officially became Menominee County, Wisconsin's 72nd county. So the Menominee Reservation being just a 5-minute drive north of Shawano, there was a lot of for lack of better terms, racism going on. A lot of the ideas were that, the reservation was bad. Now we've got to deal with all of these Indians because when the county or the reservation was turned into a county, the school buildings on the reservation did not meet state fire codes and safety standards. So those students were bused to Shawano Public Schools. And a lot of the non-Native parents were very upset about that. Fast forward to January 1st, 1975, the tribe managed to fight to be recognized again. So there's now, as of then, a Menominee Nation, and the parts of their reservation that hadn't been sold off were turned back over to them. So now after that point, you have the sentiment in town that, well, if you wanted your reservation back so bad, you should stay on it. So growing up, that was the idea. You stay on your reservation. And it didn't matter that I wasn't Menominee. It doesn't matter. I was, we were Indians. And because of the Norwegian in the family, I could do the whole pass as French Canadian. And so rather than being stereotyped, my parents chose to raise us as white and list us as white with the school district to protect us, essentially. Now, that was hard because I knew what I was, but I had to be white. And I'm sure you're all aware of No Child Left Behind. And I say it sarcastically, the brilliant success that it was. Title VI was kind of the precursor to that. Native kids were actually kind of an experiment to see how a program like that would go. And the teachers at Shawano, when I was in school, they called it the Brown Kid Room. Yes. So Native students had to be assigned to those classrooms to get, the help that they were supposed to get under the policies that allowed schools to have extra federal funding for them. And the general stereotype was, if you're a Native kid going to Shawano Public Schools at that time, and this is the 90s, 80s, 90s, and into the early 2000s, the only reason you were going to the public high school was so you could do sports, because a sports scholarship was the only way you were going to go to college. You weren't, seen as being smart enough, talented enough, to make it on your own merit. Otherwise you're just going to end up, in my case, I would be, barefoot and pregnant back on the reservation, kind of the stereotype. So it was hard for me growing up and knowing I had to hide what I was. And on top of that, knowing that I'm missing out on the language and the culture and the teachings, and not getting any of that history that I wanted in K through 12, because you don't learn about Natives in American history textbooks. So there's this feeling of, well, if I have to hide what I am, I should be ashamed of it, right? And if we're not important enough to be taught about in the history books, and what you do learn is largely about, extermination, removing, changing your bad, what that does to a kid, psychologically. And I've seen it later in life, the, what's it called? The self-fulfilling prophecies.
Right.
And the
you're
feeling
not going to trust me anyway. You're not going to, back me up anyway. I might as well just do whatever it is you're saying I'm doing, because it's
and
easier.
that imposter syndrome, where you're feeling like, am I really qualified for this? Should I really be doing these things? And it's a wonder, because Natives, our teenagers and young adults have the highest rate of suicide in the United States, the highest drug abuse rates, alcohol abuse rates. I mean, it's devastating, and they call it intergenerational trauma.
Yes.
I was gonna say, I'm like, that's what we're talking about,
That's
right?
what it
and how
is.
do you have this stress level cycle that you can't complete? You never come down from the stress and how do you fix it? How do you cover it up? You alcohol, drugs,
Oh yeah.
adrenaline junkie, something, because this is happening, and not just to you, your parents, your grandparents, your great grandparents. It's just horrible. It's hard to get people to understand that too.
And like, what were go ahead, Kate.
No.
I'm just like, no, well, just like as nurses, we look at even today as people of color, Indigenous people, Black kids, people are saying, I'm experiencing trauma in your system, in your institution. I'm trying to be resilient, but no one's listening to me. And it sounds like,
exactly.
I mean, like so many of our institutions have been built on in unhealthy patterns of relating. And I mean, just thinking about what your grandma had to go through and how she was shamed for her differences. I mean, these things are continuing, and people still don't see it. They still don't see it. They just, when you talk about Native Americans with people, it's, oh, they're drunks, or, oh, they're they got their casino. It's like all these terrible stereotypes that it's because of this intergenerational trauma and all these things that were done to them that aren't even acknowledged. Like we can't, we don't talk about that in our history classes.
And go back to your cultural humility.
Yeah.
Like if you could just stop for a minute, listen to someone's story, put yourselves in their place, and really think about how that's affecting you. And if you can't,
it was hard. I'm not gonna lie, it was hard growing up, and it all kind of hit the fan my senior year. So remember earlier I had said my parents chose not to tell the school district that I was enrolled, and the same thing with my younger brother. Well, come to find out, the summer before my senior year in high school, that there was a family that had been offering 4-year full ride scholarships to Native students to go to any UW school they wanted to, for anything, didn't matter. And you were to apply the summer after your 8th grade year, and for each class, they would award one Native student this scholarship. So every year you had a Native student graduating with this full ride scholarship. So of course, my summer after 8th grade, we didn't receive any paperwork on it because I wasn't enrolled. Yeah, I was white. And so come to find out, the summer before my senior year, the girl from my graduating class who was awarded the scholarship lost it due to violating the little ethics clause. So you had to maintain a certain grade point average. You couldn't get in trouble for anything or you'd lose the scholarship. So the class was encouraged to, Native students, resubmit your applications for the scholarship, and we're gonna pick somebody to give it to, because obviously they had lost their candidate. And my mom was, by that point in time, working for the school district. And so she heard about it. And having a good relationship with the superintendent, she went to the superintendent and said, "Can Katie apply?" And he kind of looked at her and said, "She's listed as white." And like, "Yeah, she's not white."
Surprise.
And he told my mom, he said, had she applied for it the first time, she would have gotten it. She would have had it this whole time. And my mom was really concerned. She says, "I don't want to take this opportunity. I don't want people thinking, oh, well, we're only jumping in here because it's a scholarship opportunity." I mean, my mom worked as an aide in the Shawano School District. My dad spent 35 years in the paper mill there. They weren't going to pay to send me to college. And we all know, unfortunately, taking out loans, you could be paying for college till you're 70. And they knew I wanted to go. I wanted to go. By that time, I had been president of the student council for 3 years. I was one one of the student managers for the football team. I was on the boys soccer team and the girls soccer team. I did
Kate was
theater
that
and plays.
person.
Oh, and I was.
Whole list.
Oh my gosh, yeah, good grades, everything.
Yeah.
But I didn't fit the stereotype of what a Native student should be. So my mom talked to the superintendent, and he says she needs to apply because she needs to go to school. She needs to go to school. And so I applied. And so first couple weeks of senior year, you know, get going. And one morning before school on a Monday, my mom comes to me and says, Katie, you should dress up for school today. I'm like, I was the jeans, t-shirt, ponytail, no makeup girl. The only time I wore dresses was like prom and homecoming. That was it. And even then my dad picked them out because I didn't do all the foofy lace and stuff. So she's trying to get me to dress up and I'm like, what's going on here? And I'm being set up. And she says, well, you have to go in and do an interview today for the scholarship. It's between you and a couple other people. They want to interview you. I'm like, okay, I'll put some dress pants on. All right. I get to school. I get called down to the office during first period. And it's not an interview. I was being awarded the scholarship. So she punked me.
Nice.
So my dad was there and they pulled my brother out of school and brought him there, and the newspaper was there, and the family that, you know, is the one who was giving out the scholarships, they were there. And then the freshman who was being awarded, she was there as well. And it was great. I was so excited because I knew, okay, I go to college now. I don't have to worry about how am I going to pay for this. And it was fantastic. Did pictures for the newspaper, got to have some cake. It was great. So that was all done. Got to go back to school. So third period, and I can close my eyes and see the classroom, you know, and the students sitting around me. So I'm back in third period. It was civics class. And that's when they usually do the morning announcements. And so they're running through the morning announcements. And just before the end, they announced that they wanted to congratulate the freshman who had been awarded this scholarship, as well as me, the senior who now had the scholarship.
But those are for Native Americans, Kate. You're white.
Exactly.
What are you doing?
Oh, it was awful. I was sitting in the classroom and I'm staring at the chalkboard in the front of the room. And I could feel everybody turning and looking at me, even my teacher. And I just wanted to melt. I just wanted to melt down into that chair and into the carpet and just disappear. It was rough. You know,
Wow.
my Native friends were mad at me because it was a slight against them, you know, and I could see why they were mad, you know, that I didn't suffer like they did. But the real kick in the gut was that I had some white friends who didn't want anything to do with me anymore. And I had some white friends who had parents who didn't want them to have anything to do with me anymore. And it was rough. My parents had looked into my transferring out of Shawano.
During your senior year.
During my senior year, a month after, you know, all of this went down. But had I transferred, I would have lost my scholarship. And I couldn't do that. So,
man, I just hear a lot of conflict. Yeah. Like you've had to put up with a lot of conflict in your life, like wanting to, you know, you're proud of your heritage and you want to know the language, like you relate, you feel a part of something. But when you know, it was a family secret for so long. And then when you wanted to come out and be proud of it and embrace it, it just sounds like you've had to deal with a lot of conflict, and you're like kind of in the middle of two worlds where you don't fit into either, which is what so many people, Black, brown, Indigenous people say is I don't fit in anywhere.
And you don't have to, the one thing I would add is that you don't have to exhibit all of this on the surface. So when you have folks that but you're doing well in school, so it must not be a problem.
Yeah.
No, you're on all of these sports teams and you have a fine social life. It must not be a problem. No, we go back to our both, and you grow up with that perseverance that everybody is applauding you for, means that you have to learn very early how to stuff down this in order to present this, because this is what people want to see, and this is what will make you successful in school, in college, in your work professional life when you're an adult, that you have to do these things, which means it doesn't matter much what you think or how you feel if you have to present a certain way in order to be successful.
What makes people comfortable. That's what how they want you to present.
And it was, I coped in unhealthy ways. I stopped eating. I actually had teachers at the high school. My mom worked at one of the elementary schools at the time, calling to ask if I ate at home at night because I had lost so much weight. I started cutting, and wearing long sleeves, even if it was really hot outside. It was really unhealthy, really, really unhealthy. And when I graduated high school, I couldn't get away fast enough. And I was like, okay, I'm gonna go to UW Milwaukee. I'm gonna, it has the most majors and minors and all more programs than even Madison does. So if I'll figure out what I want to do there, and it was a big city, which was a contrast to Shawano, little bitty Shawano. But I didn't fit in there either, because when I got to UW Milwaukee, I didn't fit in the city. It was terrifying at first. Oh my gosh. The first time I drove through the Marquette interchange, I cried.
Oh, it's okay. I drove through there as an adult and I still, do the white knuckle thing on the steering wheel going, oh my goodness.
like this country kid trying to fit in this city. It's like, why don't it fit here either? But I found the American Indian Student Services office at UWM, and they became family. And they saw how I was struggling and said, let's sign you up for some Native history courses. Let's get you in some Native anthropology or sociology courses, trying to help fill this void. And that's what it was. It was this hungriness for basically, what I had been denied growing up. It's, and I laugh too, because growing up I was raised Lutheran, because of course that's what grandma wanted. So I went through confirmation and everything. I did all that. I memorized everything I needed to memorize. And we had these, you had to meet with the pastor before you could get confirmed. And I sat down with him and he looked at me and he says, Katie, I know you don't believe any of this. I'm like, what do I believe? I was like, I said, I don't, people talk about how, you're supposed to feel so fulfilled and so comforted by, the Bible and the verses and the teachings and, and I felt so empty yet, I said, I'm not feeling how I'm supposed to feel. And I thought, oh gosh, if I don't get confirmed, my mom and my grandma are going to strangle me. And he said, you know everything you need to know. And he says, and you're a good person. He says, that's all that matters. Just when you find what you need to find, as long as you're a good person, that's all that mattered. And when I finally got to UWM and I was around people that understood me, I started coming around and feeling a little bit better about who I was and expressing it. But it was sad that it took, 19 years, to find a place where I kind of felt like I fit in.
The value.
Another.
Go ahead.
Sorry.
Go ahead.
Another thing that you said earlier on that we kind of glossed over. I went to a class to learn about how we should be talking about Native American, American Indian, First Nations history in school, and it was taught by David O'Connor, which is, you know, and he's such a fun guy. He really
I love
is.
David. He's fantastic.
He really is. But one of the things that he started out his our workshop with was, let's talk about the three beings in this world that have a pedigree that's measured for identification.
Yes.
You know, we've got dogs, we've got horses, and we've got Indians. And, you know, and we're like, And I do remember one time that that you showed me your card. Like here, proof.
Yep. I believe I actually held it up at a school board meeting too. At one of the school board meetings, I was so incensed by a comment somebody made that I was like, here's my card. I am literally Oneida of Wisconsin, number 12,480. That is me. If you look at the records, I am number 12,480.
That is, that blows my mind. And like a couple of things you said, we're not in the 1890s, right? We are in 2021 now.
And the ironic thing is, these percentages that we are forced to identify ourselves by are from the allotment era. So they're from literally the 1870s and 1880s. So my number is based off of what my dad was and what my grandmother was and what her parents were and their parents were. But how are you supposed to tell what percentage people actually are? I mean, and these DNA tests that come out today, they're for entertainment. They are not something you should be basing your family history off of, because really they're only looking at your maternal side and about 17% of your maternal side. So how back then in the 1880s was the federal government able to determine, oh, well, you're full blood, or you're 75, or you're half? They'd actually look for birthmarks, Mongolian birthmarks, so very dark birthmarks. Yeah, the same ones that would brand you a witch during the Salem witch trials.
Lovely.
Yeah.
Wow.
So they'd look for birthmarks. They would, there was a cranium measurement that they would take. There was actually this scale.
Oh my gosh.
That was created where the larger your head was, the larger your cranium size, the bigger your brain, the smarter you were. And there was a scale. And of course, it was just like the the St. Louis World's Fair White City that was created, where the lighter your skin color was, the bigger your skull. And then heads got smaller as you got to the darker skin races. So there was this kind of area within that measurement that natives were supposed to fall. And they would literally get a compass and a grease marker out and measure the various points on your skull and see where your measurement fit. And if your head was on the larger side, then that must mean you had more white ancestry.
My goodness. Yes, I just posted about something similar to this. I'm going to read you the quote from Toni Morrison. The very serious function of racism is distraction. It keeps you from doing your work. It keeps you explaining over and over again your reason for being. Somebody says you have no language and you spend 20 years proving that you do. Somebody says your head isn't shaped properly, so you have scientists working on the fact that it is. Somebody says you have no art, so you dredge that up. Somebody says you have no kingdoms, so you dredge that up. None of that is necessary. There will always be one more thing.
Yep. That's very fitting. Well, and one of the ones I have my students do is actually called a scratch test, where you hold out your arm and you flip your arm up, palm up, and you take your fingernail and you scratch your forearm. And the faster that scratch turns red, the more white you are. So they would actually send commissioners around and scratch the inside of your arm, and there was a counting. They would count, and however long it took meant that that's what percentage white or percentage native you were.
Oh, wow.
It's insane. And those are the percentages we have to use today
Mhm.
to determine how much we are. It's crazy.
There's
This is wild.
there's no institutional racism.
Mm-mm.
There's only happy things in American history.
Mm-mm.
Mhm.
Mm-mm. That's all there is. Well, so, and I know that we if we stay here all day, I mean, it could be fun, but I'm not sure if CPL radio really wants us to. But I do want to ask, we've talked about your grandma, we've talked about you. What about your daughter? What kind of, a lot of us as parents, we're either going to do all the things our parents did because we thought they were great, or we're going to
Yep.
do everything they didn't do because it was horrible and you can do so much better. And then you're a parent, you're like, oh, that's why they did that. Yeah, that was hard.
Yes.
So how does that look for you and your family raising your daughter?
Well, it's definitely one of those things where I am keenly aware of what I wish could have been done differently. And so for her, technically she's an 8th Oneida, which right now does not meet enrollment. You have to be at least a quarter, but she is listed as a descendant. And I definitely made the decision even before she was born that she was going to have a Native identity. Her first name is Miyakota. It's an indigenous name. And I really haven't gone too far into specifically Oneida culture, history, religion, longhouse, the traditional things. But I definitely, from early on, read her our traditional teaching stories and talked about how important family is and family structure and respect, and how we are to look to and treat the environment, and teaching her history in a way that's appropriate for whatever age she is at the time.
Sure.
Because the history, it's ugly,
Right.
and you have to be careful with how you cover things. She
Right.
knows about her great grandmother's history in the
Mhm.
boarding schools and whatnot, and some of those struggles, but really trying to have her be proud of who she is.
Yeah.
She's not full Native. That doesn't matter. That
Right.
doesn't matter. That
Right.
she's got that blood in her, and I want her to be proud of who she is and to know who she is. So I'm definitely filling in where schools are kind of lacking in what they cover, but in the end, I want her to feel like she belongs and that she's
Yes.
not lost.
Yes, that is a thing that we wish for all the children. And
Mm.
and as we continue to have conversations here in our area, to really understand what it feels like to be outside of that welcoming and belonging circle.
Mhm.
And it's one thing when you don't know, but then and what do you do to make that better? We don't need to continue the generational trauma for the next few generations because we just don't feel like changing anything. I mean, like I said, it's one thing to not understand something or not be aware of something, but once you're aware, you've got to do something to move that needle forward. And
Mhm.
and that's the expectation, that's the request, and we shouldn't have to beg for it,
Mm.
right? You shouldn't have
Exactly.
to beg to say, please see us, please recognize us, please acknowledge our value to society. Like
Mhm.
who should be doing that? that's not a thing though. Like, but
Mm.
Kate, this was fantastic. I think that we
Yes.
should have
Fun.
a weekly session with Kate. So we'll have to make that happen. We
Kate
know
has
some
a lot more
people.
to say, I think.
Oh yeah. Oh
My dad was always, he teased me. You actually found a job where people pay you to talk? What the?
perfect.
I said, yeah, they give me 3 hours of class time every week. Like, I don't know
Yay.
how you manage that, but
and that's another part of what we say, right? For Bridge the Divide, you're the similar to the bloom where you're planted, right? Work in your circle of influence.
Yep.
You don't have to
Mhm.
necessarily fly across the country, do something that you're not interested in or not familiar with to say that you've done it. There are things that you can do. You're in your backyard, you're still in the state, you're still learning things and enjoying sharing them, and And that is making a difference. And
Mhm.
all of those differences are super important, and we need to do it in any space, any sphere that we can. So I
Exactly.
thank you for doing that. And I'm sure that your students, after you've graded and they've left your class, will also thank you later.
Yes. Well, it's quite surprising because my courses aren't required. They do fulfill certain requirements, and especially if you're going for a teaching license in Wisconsin, it fulfills certain requirements. But so many of my students, their last assignment they turn in, they tell me, I wish I wouldn't have waited until college to learn these things.
Mhm.
Mhm.
And that why is it just by chance I thought this looked interesting? Am I only learning this now?
Mhm.
Yep.
So I see in their writings that they want to know, they want to learn more, and that they're definitely more empathetic to the issues and wanting to see change, that hopefully we can end this intergenerational trauma
Mm.
in hopefully less than 2 or 3 generations.
I know, that would be lovely. We'll take it. And anything, Kate, that any websites or any thoughts or any articles that you want to share with us, we can put in our show notes. That maybe it's the first time that some of our listeners are really starting to connect on this topic, and there can be some things they can read and learn and grow from. So we'll get those from you after and stick those in our show notes.
That's fantastic.
And
I've got
again,
plenty.
hopefully
Oh,
have
good.
you here a million more times. We really appreciate it. I think that the only thing that we have coming up here soon is there's a Black Lives Are Sacred MKE public witness in Grafton this weekend. So if you check out our Facebook page, and I think it's on Instagram too, it's for an hour. It's not a march. It's standing and bearing witness. And to me, that is a big thing to me, because again, one of the ways to be seen, because I am a Christian, to think, wow, if Christians could see and feel this grief, that bearing witness and lamenting together corporately is just going to be a beautiful thing. So you are invited for that. That's this Saturday, the 22nd at 10 a.m. And we will continue to work on trying to have some meet and greets this summer, because our Bridge community has been spread over all kinds of screens and we haven't seen each other. And if you go back a couple generations in my family, you got to get in there and hug somebody's neck and feel kind of connected again. So looking forward to doing some of those things later on this summer. Thank you so very much for listening. Everybody have a fantastic day, and we'll see you again next go round.
Thanks for listening. We welcome your feedback, suggestions, and any program ideas. Spoken Word Artist Propaganda states, we need to consider the waters we swim in. Maybe it's not toxic to me, but it's toxic to my neighbor. And if it's toxic to my neighbor, it's probably toxic to me too. Let's breathe better water. Contact us on our website at www.bridgethedivide.life. You can email us info@bridgethedivide.life, or reach us on social media. Facebook is Bridge the Divide Community, and on Instagram it's Bridge the Divide Podcast.